Lovely. All right, we're going to begin with another Bible reading. So if you get your orders of service out, I would like to read with you now the section that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 1 through 12. It's found in your orders of service once again. Let me just give you a little bit of background. The book of Deuteronomy is actually the fifth book in the Old Testament of our Bible. So if you're looking for Deuteronomy later, if you just start at the beginning and work through, you'll come to the fifth book, and that's the book of Deuteronomy. It was written by Moses and was given to the nation of Israel just before they crossed over the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, which was the land that God had promised them. They'd just finished 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and a lot of grumbling in the wilderness as well. And Moses had been told by God that he wouldn't be actually going into the land, but the nation would be. And so what Moses then did was prepare a whole series of sermons, probably, and they've been woven together into the book of Deuteronomy as we currently have it. And so those sermons were designed to prepare the nation for its entry into the land as God had promised them. So let's read from chapter 6, verses 1 to 12 together. So remember, it's Moses speaking, and this is what he says. These are the commands, decrees and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, a land with large flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things that you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Now, in some ways, this section in Deuteronomy gives us the Bible's strategy for parenting. That's why it's a good passage for us to look at when we're talking about a dedication service and commitments that parents are making. So what I want to actually do in this next little while, as I share a bit of a talk with you, is I want to talk about three things today. If you're wanting to take notes, or just remember, these are your three main points. Firstly, I want to talk about the power of parenting, The second thing I want to talk about is the dilemma of parenting. And the third thing is the key to parenting. So there we have it, three things: the power, the dilemma, and the key to parenting. I trust these things are useful, particularly to Nathan and Shani today, as we reflect on them. So firstly, let me begin with the power of parenting. Now, I'm sure that we've all been shocked by the events of the past week and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And I think most of us in Western nations are thinking and hoping, we were thinking and hoping that Putin's threats were just political manoeuvring to try and gain some advantage. We just couldn't see the logic of why he would invade a peaceful nation that was obviously not threatening him. And now he has, and thousands of lives potentially will be lost. And at least those of us in the Western nations anyway saying, why? Why is it? Why has he done that? And it's interesting, for the last decade, a number of scholars and analysts have been watching the rise of Putin and have been trying to understand who Putin actually is. Who is this man? In some ways, he came out of obscurity, and now he holds absolute power in Russia. And so Western scholars are saying, who is this man and how did this come about? One writer that has recently attempted this is a French philosopher, and I'm not going to pronounce his second name. I have no idea how it's pronounced. I'm going to call him Michael. And he's written a book called Inside the Mind of Vladimir Putin. There's the title of the book. It's a couple of years old now. Inside the Mind of Vladimir Putin. Now, what he suggests in his first chapter, that to understand Putin, we need to go back to his childhood and we need to look at the influences that were present as he was growing up as a boy. And as we look at these and understand these influences, we start to understand why he's doing what he's doing today in our world. And so I'm going to give you the four influences. So if you're taking notes, just note these four things. It was very helpful for me just going back and unlocking this and reading through this to help me understand Putin and why he is doing what he's doing. The first and major influence on him was the patriotism that was taught to him by his parents and grandparents. They were very patriotic. His grandfather, actually interesting, had worked as a chef for Lenin. And then during the Stalinist era, his father then fought in the Second World War, resisting the German armies. And his story itself is just fascinating. At one point, he had to escape the Germans, and he fled and lay down in a dam or a pool, and with a reed, breathed through a reed for long enough until they left and went. But he was severely wounded at one point and nearly lost his life. So he was deeply involved in the resistance by Russia to the invading German troops in the Second World War. And he was the father of Putin. And his father and his mother brought him up with a fervent love and a commitment to the Soviet dream and the Soviet Empire. So you've got to understand that. When Putin was a little bit older, or recently, he gave an interview that helped us to understand how deeply patriotic his family was and how he was brought up to share that patriotism. And this is what he said in that interview. He said, "All the members of my family love Russia and showed themselves to be patriots toward my fatherland and raised me precisely in that spirit." Indeed, as his future life was to show, he might not have been committed to the ideology of communism, which he seems to have abandoned, but he was deeply committed to this idea from the earliest of ages. The supreme thing in life was to be loyal to one's country, to love one's country. So that was the first influence, a deep patriotism that was taught to him by his parents and grandparents. The second influence that the young Putin immersed himself in was the military culture of Russia. It's interesting, in her Chronicles of Life in the USSR, there's a Belarusian writer, and once again, I'm not going to pronounce her name because I have no idea how to do it, but she emphasises this trait, this military culture that permeated Russian life. She says this: "Our country was a military country. 70% of our economy was in the service of the army, and also our best minds, physicians, mathematicians, everybody, men, women and children, were subject to military ideology. Education was militaristic, and children were obliged to read war literature as preparation for self-sacrifice. Military service, with its atrocious humiliations and initiation ceremonies, constituted one of the most important moments in Soviet life. In general, the mood of all aspects of existence was martial, featuring parades, hero and martyr cults, and collective disciplines." So what she's saying is that the world in which Putin grew up was a world that affirmed and celebrated military culture. Moreover, one of the Soviets that she interviewed in writing this particular piece said, "In the struggle between the capitalistic and communist worlds, there is no line between a state of peace and a state of war. We are always at war." Now, the West thought the war ended with the collapse of the Iron Curtain. But if you listen to what she is saying, she's saying no, for Russian people, it went on. It continued in a meaningful way in this military culture that was a part of life for them. The third influence on Putin was a belief in the permanent victory of the Soviet Empire. Now, one of the important characteristics of the military culture in Russia was the belief that ultimately it would end in permanent victory for the Soviet Empire and for the Soviet dream. And this was aided by the fact that it was the USSR that was the first to halt the German advance in the Second World War. And it was their resistance to the Germans advancing into Russia that the Russians would particularly say is what turned the tide of the Second World War and reversed the advance of the German armies. And so Stalin, in the eyes of Russia, was the great victor in the Second World War, and it was he that conferred upon the Russians the expectation of a permanent victory thereafter. And Putin made this clear at the beginning of his third rule in 2012 when he said this in his Victory Day speech on 2012. He says, we have an immense moral right, all right, hear that? We have an immense moral right to defend our positions in a fundamental and lasting way because our country was the one subjected to the bulk of the Nazi offensive, and it was our country that offered freedom to the peoples of the whole world. Now, in other words, what Putin is saying is that the world owes us a huge debt because we took on the bulk of the Nazi offensive and we were the ones who defeated it. Now, incidentally, for those of you that are watching the language from Putin at the moment and what's coming out, is this helps us to understand why he's recently, and I couldn't understand it until I read this, I couldn't understand why he kept on denouncing the neo-Nazis that were being harboured in Ukraine. Well, now you can understand this is why he's using that terminology, because from his perspective anyway, it was the Russians that defeated the Nazis in the Second World War, and now what we have now is more neo-Nazis emerging in Ukraine, and we've got to in turn defeat them again. So that's where his language is coming from, if we are to understand him correctly. So that's the third influence, is this idea of the permanent victory of the Soviet Empire and that the world owes a response to that. The fourth and final influence is his conviction that the demise of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That's a statement that he's made recently. In 2005, during his official speech to the two chambers of the Russian Federation Assembly, Putin produced a statement that would later on become his most famous. He says this in that speech: first and foremost, it is worth acknowledging that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Now, 2 years later, in 2007, he explained to Time magazine that he had spoken those words in a humanitarian spirit. He said, what did the collapse of the Soviet Union really mean? Well, he said, what it really meant is that 25 million Soviet citizens who were ethnic Russians found themselves outside of Russia's borders. And no one, he says, gave them any thought. So 25 million people found themselves abroad without any means, where they couldn't return to Russia, their historic homeland. So this, you see, in a sense, helps us to understand why the invasion of Ukraine is taking place. In his mind, he's delivering freedom to the Ukrainian people so they can return to their true homeland, which is Russia. Now, you know, we can look at all of that from a Western perspective and it puzzles us. But when you start to get inside the mind of Putin, you can start to see how it makes sense in some way what is actually taking place. Now, why have I told you all that? Well, I've told you because it illustrates in a very contemporary way the power of parenting and the convictions that we form in early life. What our parents teach us and what the lessons we learn early are often the things that then characterise us and shape us thereafter. And so the Putin that we're seeing today is really just living out what he was taught as a boy and the lessons he took on and the principles and values that he made his own. Now, we're looking at what's happening in Ukraine and we're just absolutely appalled at the destruction of human life that is taking place. But in Putin's mind, the destruction of human life is a secondary thing to the primary value of seeing the Soviet Empire restored to its former glory. So in his mind, patriotism and the triumph of the Soviet Empire is the ultimate value. The loss of human life is secondary to that. Years ago, the music group, and this is going back to my era, I apologise for that. The music group Crosby, Stills and Nash had a hit song, and there was a repeated phrase in that song, and that was, "Teach your children well. Teach your children well." I know there's some people nodding, they remember it. Now, the reason that's important is because that's the power of parenting. All right? Teach our children well because it's going to shape them. It's just one of the wonderful privileges that God has given us as parents. You know, we're given a little child and it's almost like they're clay to a degree, and we have a huge influence on how that clay is shaped. Everyone makes their own decisions as they get later into life, but parents have a huge power in that process of shaping those children. So and that's the reason I'm sharing that story. It's because it's contemporary for us, but also it's a tragic illustration of how shaped in a certain way now is resulting in massive consequences for world history. All right, so that's the power of parenting. That leads me to my second point, and that is the dilemma of parenting. All right, the dilemma of parenting. Several years ago, there was a poll taken of about 2,400 parents, and they were asked, what is your greatest fear for your child? What is your greatest fear? And they actually came up with 5 top parenting fears. Here was the top one. Listen to it. The top fear was, I'm afraid my child won't get the education and opportunities she needs to reach her potential. That was the greatest fear. That was a few years ago now, but I think that in many ways it's probably still one of the greatest fears for parents. You know, we look at our children and we want the best for them. And we become very fearful when, say, maybe that's denied for them at school and so on and so on. Not long after we moved from Melbourne to Sydney, because I don't hold it against us, but we're actually Victorians. We moved up here in 1998, so we're almost New South Welshmans, I guess. But not long after I moved up here, my dad rang me from Melbourne. My dad had a business, and he had a lawsuit between somebody else who bought one of his products, and there was, to try and resolve it, there was a mediation hearing taking place in Parramatta, and Dad said, well, look, rather than have me fly up, I'm wondering if you can go and represent me at the hearing. So I had no idea of the detail of the case, so I said, Dad, send me as much information as you can. So he sent the information to me, and I went to Parramatta, and I sat down in this room, and in the room was this aggrieved party and a few other peoples. And then there was the mediator, and then there was me, all sitting by my lonesome. And I was feeling rather intimidated by the process, but then the mediator got me to explain my perspective, or my dad's perspective. Then got them to explain their perspective. And then he said at the end of it, he said, now, is there any reconciliation? Can we resolve this between the two of you? And I've been sitting there and I'm thinking, you know, my case is pretty solid. As far as I'm concerned, we've won this thing. And so I just said, no. As far as I'm concerned, it's all their responsibility. And he said, and what about you? And they said, no, we're sticking with our position as well. And he said, well, you know what this means? He says, it means that I have to go and make a decision and impose it upon both of you. So do you really want that? And I'm sitting there still quite convinced of the rightness of my position. And so I said, no, that's absolutely fair. And so a few months later, I said to Dad, what happened with that mediation process? What was the end result of it? And he said, he said something, we lost everything. He said, we didn't get a single dollar, they got everything. And I was baffled by that. I thought my case was so strong. What went wrong? But what it was is a huge illustration to me of the fact that we can totally misread what's actually happening. You know, I thought I was reading the room. I was misreading it completely. And so this leads me to what I mean by the dilemma of parenting, is that as we parent, you know, we do the best we can. We really try to make the right decisions at the time, but there's a dilemma in that sometimes we just don't know what the end result's going to actually be. You see, because none of us really know the future, we're actually forced to rely on the advice of others. We need to rely on other authorities. In 2014, that's a long time ago now, it was estimated that it was 253 million, get that number, 253 million hits a day for Google searches on parenting advice. Now, I'm sure that's higher than that today, but imagine that. When Carol and I started life as parents, we had not even heard of the internet. So our Google search was pumping every good parent we could find for information on what they'd done right or wrong. Every time we spotted a good parent, tell me everything you've done. I need to know, because these kids are driving me crazy and I've just no idea how to manage them, so tell me what you've done. That was our internet. Now, the reason that was important is because, you see, none of us have an infinite amount of knowledge or really know the future. All we have to rely on is information that others give us or the experience of others or so on and so on. And the scary thing with parenting is that you really don't get a second shot at it. I've discovered as grandparents you actually do. I really think grandparents should do the parenting. We should flip it around, because that doesn't work, does it? But the thing is, the way I grandparent is very different to the way I parented. I hope it's more intelligent. I don't really know. But the reality is that we shape our children in certain directions in the present, but it's only the future that will really tell us whether we've done a good job of it or not. And so we often form our parenting from a hodgepodge of books, advice we've received from others, and most frequently, and I say this all seriously, most frequently from the way our own parents parented us. We don't realise it, but we live out their example in so many different ways. But we don't really know where it's all going to end up. One of the greatest tragedies I encounter as a pastor is that it's parents that come to me whose children have gone completely off the rails in their mid to late teens. And my desire in those situations is always to try and give them hope. But when I dig down, I actually find often or not there was some major parenting mistakes that were made early. And now we're living with it. And, you know, God can change anything. He does. God is amazing. God's a miracle worker, and so he can change those situations. But so often our kids live out the reality of what we taught them. And so sometimes as parents we just have to wait and pray it out. But that's the dilemma of parenting, you see. On the one hand, most of us desire of all things to get this one right. I've never yet met a parent really that says, yeah, I just want to be a bad parent. Most parents, no matter how hard you're struggling, they still want to do a good job of parenting. It's still the deepest desire of our hearts as parents. We want the best for our children. But on the other hand, none of us have a crystal ball. None of us know how it's going to turn out right in the end. We don't know whether the decisions that we're taking now or the parenting advice we're listening to is going to be the right one in the end. So that's the dilemma of parenting. And this leads me to my third and final point, which is the key to parenting. All right, the key to parenting. Now, the Bible passage that we read today, as I said to you before, really provides us with a parenting strategy from the early life of the nation of Israel. And as I said to you before, it was written by Moses at the end of a long and fruitful life, and just before 2 million odd people were going to cross over the River Jordan and go into the land of Canaan and take up residence there and eventually become modern-day Israel. And just before they cross over the river, Moses draws them all together and he gives them a summary of the commands and laws that God had given them over their 40 years of wandering. And there were 3 main reasons why they were to observe these laws, and we find that in verses 2 and 3. 3 main reasons why they were to do this. He says, firstly, so that they might enjoy long life. And secondly, that things would go well with them. And thirdly, that they would increase greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey. Now, this description, flowing with milk and honey, was a metaphorical way of describing a land that was so agriculturally rich and abundant. And what God is saying to them is, Moses is saying to them, do this so that when you go into the land, you'll prosper, you'll have a long life, and the land you're living in will be flowing with milk and honey. So what Moses is doing is painting a generalised picture of the beauty of life that would flow for the nation if they lived according to God's laws and commands. He's saying they will enjoy a long life, things will go well, they'll flourish numerically in the land, and it'll be a land that will yield rich agricultural fruitfulness. That's a picture of a nation and land that would experience amazing human flourishing. And this rich way of life was to be for them and their children after them. Well, that's what he's saying here. It was to be, this way of life and this blessing was to be a perpetual thing down through the generations. Now the key to this abundant way of life, however, was that God's commands and laws were to be perpetually upon their minds and dwelling in their hearts. And this is what Moses says in verses 6 to 9. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Now, we know that some Jews literally do these things, but even if you don't do them literally, you get the idea of what Moses is saying. He's saying these laws and these commandments are to be communicated to your children constantly, wherever you are. If you're walking along the road, communicate it to them. If you're in the house, communicate it to them. As you're walking out through the doorway, communicate it to them. So what he's giving us here is the key to this kind of life that God wants for them as they move into the land of Canaan. Now, because Christianity is rooted in the faith of Israel, Christians would say that the same principles apply to us today. The key to our children growing up to live a life of abundance and flourishing is to be found in them living according to the principles of the Bible. So from this perspective, the key to successful parenting is modelling and teaching these principles to our children in ever increasingly beautiful and relevant ways. Now, shortly, you'll hear Nathan and Shani committing to this. And as they do so, it will be reflecting a belief that the Bible is God's wisdom and that living and teaching Marley according to its principles will ultimately be the best possible hope for her to have an abundant and flourishing life. Now, ultimately, as we noted before, she has to accept it for herself. And just because they parent her in this way doesn't necessarily guarantee she will follow it. However, what we do know is the influence of parents is so huge that if parents do this, they set that direction in a way that creates that possibility much more strongly. In many ways, if you accept this, it really radically simplifies life and parenting. As I said before to you, if you were to Google parenting today, you'll find an overwhelming amount of advice. You really do. That's the worst thing about Google. You punch in the search terms and then, what do we do with this? So, if you were as a parent to say, okay, all these items I need to read, you could spend the rest of your life while your kids are growing up reading the parenting advice that's on the internet. They could be literally grown up by the time you'd finished. And even as you're trying to finish, there'd be more stuff being added. And so that's the problem, you see. And the other problem is that, confusingly, much of it will conflict, and you'll find yourself fearfully at times deciding between various options. And as you choose between the different options, you're wondering and hoping that you've chosen the right option. And that fear is aggravated when we recognise, as I said before, that our choices do have consequences, and our children will partially, if not totally, reflect the impact of those choices upon them. However, for many of us, so the point I'm making is it simplifies things enormously when you say, okay, I accept the Bible is God's revelation to humankind, and it's his wisdom reflected in it. And so because he made us, and because he understands us, and because he knows where we're going, then it makes it a lot more simple to say, okay, I'll take my prime parenting advice from him, from this Bible. However, let me just add one thing to that. For many of us, there will be problems with making the Bible our final authority in parenting. The reason I say that is because you may have a Bible and you may have read the Bible, and there may be questions that have arisen for you out of reading the Bible. There may be deep challenges that have come in your life that make you question aspects of the Bible. And I'm going a little bit personally, guys, and just travel with me. Nathan and his family have experienced one of the deepest challenges imaginable to anybody recently. You've lost a son and you lost a father in the space of a very short period of time. That level of pain, that level of suffering is something that only you know, having gone through it. Others don't necessarily know that level of suffering and pain. Now, in the midst of suffering of that kind, in the midst of a loss of that kind, it opens you up at the core as to the big questions of life. What's it all really about? Those questions are inevitable. Why my brother? Why my dad? Why these circumstances? In fact, I was reflecting on this a bit when I was corresponding with Nathan and Shani about this dedication. And I shared that with them. I said, in some ways, Nathan, there's few 30-year-olds that have had to say goodbye to a brother and a father in the space of a couple of years. In our world, that's highly unusual. But that means in many ways that he, as a dad, has a very special gift to offer to his daughter. He offers her a father that will never minimise or take for granted the preciousness of life. And that means potentially for Nathan, there's a richness to his parenting that wouldn't necessarily be true of other fathers. But with all that said, still there's a sense in which suffering raises questions for us, and we wouldn't be human if it didn't. By my encouragement to Nathan and Shani, and my encouragement to all of us, is that when we experience times like that, we need to push through deeper into the Bible and deeper into God. One of the reasons I say this, because 10 years ago, I went through my own personal questioning of my faith. It was a deep, dark time for me where I really had some big issues and questions that I needed answered, and I just weren't getting them. And it was a dark and very difficult time, and it forced me to go back to my faith at a deeper level. And what it actually did was it forced me to go back and compare Christianity to all other major religions in the world. Because suddenly, for the first time in my life, and I'm a pastor in a church, crazy, isn't it? But I'm really saying to myself, is this really the legit thing? And so I started to go back and I did a lot of research in those years in comparing Christianity to the other faiths. And one of the reasons I'm still a Christian is because out of that experience, I became convinced that while there are mysteries associated with the Christian faith, that the Bible correctly understood and interpreted provides the most credible and satisfactory explanation of life and the human situation as we know it. All right, hear me there. What I'm saying is there's still mysteries associated with Christianity and with our faith. What I'm saying is that when you compare it to all the other explanations of life, I really am convinced, as a result of that journey, that Christianity provides us with the most credible and satisfactory answers that I've found. And that's why my encouragement to you is in the midst of those questions to go deeper rather than to walk away from it. And that's my closing encouragement to you today, particularly Nathan and Shani, is to make God and the Bible central to your home and central to your life. And as you do that, you'll be using this key to parenting. All right? You'll be unlocking the wisdom of God, who made all things, who knows all things, knows exactly how Marley's going to grow up and how best to parent her in that journey to that point. So thanks for paying attention throughout. It's been a long journey, but I trust it's actually useful to you. So what we've done now is we've come to the dedication time in our service. And in order to follow that through, what we're actually going to do is we're going to get Nathan and Shani and Marley to come up. I'll get you guys to stand on my right side, and we're going to get the godparents, which is Sean and Samantha, to come as well. And you guys can stand over on my left side. And then what I'll do is I'll just introduce us to the dedication, and then we'll share some statements together.